we go.
All right. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. I appreciate you coming in today on this very dreary May spring day here. I'd love to introduce you all to Andrea Logan from the Office of Innovation at the DOE. She is a MTSS specialist. And because, this grant is intended to help schools implement evidence-based strategies and interventions that help to foster a safe and healthy and welcoming school environment to really positively impact students' academic and well-being outcomes, right? Healthy outcomes through prevention and early intervention and comprehensive support. I just thought it'd be really wonderful to have Andrea come in and tell us about what's happening with MTSS these days. I know some schools are having a little challenging times getting themselves organized into a highly efficient MTSS system. So, Andrea, thank you so much for coming and talking to us today. We'd be really excited to learn from you.
Absolutely. I'm happy to do it. Okay. And so, of course, today can serve as, so my plan today is to go over, Maine's MTSS framework so that any folks that have not been maybe in trainings recently or are looking for maybe some updates on kind of how things are progressing sort of behind the scenes. So I figure I could set a stage for that. And then based on our discussion earlier, and I had taken a look at kind of what your outcome goals were for this time. And so what I've done is I've put together a bit of some, a bit of like some action planning in terms of alignment. So like how could a school use MTSS as a structure to help bolster the goals of the Stronger Connections work, but also to help create sustainability going forward. So does that sound okay?
That sounds great.
All right, perfect. Hope I don't over or under deliver based on what we just said. Okay, so as Anne mentioned, so my name is Andrea Logan. I'm the multi-tiered systems of support specialist here at the Maine DOE. I am a team of one. I say that only to just kind of preface that, for the size of the state of Maine, many states across the nation have sometimes 5 or even up to 10 MTSS specialists. We have one. And so things are a little bit slower going over time in terms of like things that are created and set out there and put out there for you, but that I am always available via email or by phone. So if you ever find yourself like in a position where you're like, oh, I really could use some support with this, like, please don't hesitate to reach out, because if I haven't created something to put out there, that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't exist. It might just mean that just hasn't been at the top of the scale, or maybe I just need just sort of not a kick in the seat, but like, just something to sort of like kind of get me going and thinking in things of areas where maybe there are needs that I have not previously thought of. And so as I am representing the Department of Education, I just need to share with you that our mission is to promote the best learning opportunities for all Maine students, and that the work that's being presented here today really has 2 purposes. The first being that it is aimed to help the state of Maine DOE work towards its strategic goals, but also to help Maine schools and educators work through their vision and mission towards meeting the needs of their students. And so everything that is presented here is intended for that purpose. If you have any questions about any of the presentation, please don't hesitate to reach out. And if you want to learn more about the DOE's strategic goals and how they can help you with your work, you can visit the Maine DOE website, and they are available for you there. Okay, so what is this all about? So basically, I really wanted to ask the question of how can the use of a school-wide MTSS framework help with the sustainability and the work/goals of Stronger Connections? So ultimately, we're going to be looking a lot at alignment of MTSS with Stronger Connections. And then we've got a little bit of some learning outcomes. So things like how, the how-tos of future planning, the how-tos of student supports, and then the how-tos of sustainability. And then even though I won't be presenting probably for the whole hour, but there is a 1-hour contact credit for certificate available for you at the end, so that if you're eligible for, as long as we meet for up to 30 minutes, you're eligible for 1 hour of contact hours, should you need that for your records. Okay, so diving right into Maine's MTSS framework. really the framework has, as it has evolved and developed, has really come down to what I'm calling a 541 model. And that 541 model is that there are 5 critical components, there are 4 delivery pillars, and together these things create one big idea of what MTSS is and what the purpose is of a full-scale MTSS. But before I get down into the 541, I just want to mention that the 541, as it is being presented, really is rooted very solidly in the implementation science work of the National Implementation Research Network out of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So Dean Fixon is often considered the father of implementation science. He is the one that has done a majority of the initial research in implementation science and implementation drivers. And so I just wanted to just sort of like establish that the 541 model that we are currently implementing and currently putting into place is rooted in scientific and research-based practices. And if you'd like more information, there's a link at the very end of the presentation to the NERN Center, where you can find out more information on how implementation science might help you with any new initiatives or anything that you're looking to put in place as it relates to your grant and your goals. Okay, so of the 541, here are the 5 critical components of Maine's multi-tiered system of support framework. And looking at these critical components, we're going to go through each one in turn, but that really, these are rooted in the leadership and organization. So if you remember the triangle on this page here, leadership and organization really are 2 of the major implementation drivers for new initiatives and for school-wide initiatives. And so these 5 critical components really align with that leadership and organization portion of implementation. And so the number 1 critical component is that schools are utilizing a leadership team that uses live data to improve foundational components of MTSS. They're using that data to allocate resources appropriately, and they're using it to establish an infrastructure necessary for equitable access for all students. This is really important because your leadership team and how your leadership team is utilizing that time really creates that foundation for access and equity, which is really the ultimate goal. We often think of MTSS as being an academic-based thing. In some cases, we think of it as being a behavior-based thing, but really it's an resource allocation thing, and that is intended to improve the outcomes of academics, attendance, social and emotional growth, behavior growth, and things like that. The second critical component is that schools are utilizing multi-levels of teams that are using evidence-based processes to evaluate universal instructional integrity. So there will be a school-wide team, which often is that same team that you would saw in critical component number 1, but then also that they're utilizing grade level teams to really dig down into that instructional integrity and student response to instruction and support. And then these teams together identify growth areas for instructional practices across all tiers. Number 3 is that schools are prioritizing effective universal instruction, otherwise known as Tier 1, for all students. So as much as humanly possible, all students should have access to and should be participating in Tier 1 instruction, regardless of 504, multilingual learner, IEP, et cetera, and that we're also ensuring relevant and timely access to additional and intensified support when indicated. And so those we often refer to as tiers 2 and tiers 3. The other thing being that the tiers are supplemental and not supplanted. So a student receiving tier 1 instruction, which should be everybody, if that student indicates that there is a need for tier 2 instruction, they would be receiving the tier 1 as well as the tier 2. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Best practice is that when a student has indicated there is a need that they need to receive tier 3 instruction in a full-scale school-wide MTSS, they would be receiving tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 instruction, and that would be layered on top of each other with higher intensities, more narrowed instructional focus, et cetera, et cetera. In Maine, what I often see, and nationwide, is a supplant system where a student is like, oh yeah, I'm receiving tier 1 instruction all the time, and now I need tier 2 instruction in addition to it. Okay, that's great. But then time comes along, and then that child has indicated that they need a tier 3 intensity, whether it's academic or behavior, and suddenly they're being moved from the tier 2 in order to be moved into the tier 3. Now, that is a misconception as to how the tiers of support are intended to be layered. And so really thinking about prioritizing the effectiveness of universal tier 1, but then layering of the tiers on top of that as we move forward when student needs indicate that. The fourth critical component, if you're not overwhelmed already, I would say is probably the hardest of all 5 to achieve. And that is that schools are creating libraries of evidence-based resources that ensure that equitable access for all students. What do I mean by a library of evidence-based resources? Well, one thing that I tend to see a lot and is something that a lot of schools really grapple with is if special education, for example, purchases this program, then this program is intended for special education only. If a tier 2 program purchases this program or this set of materials, then they're intended for tier 2 only. And so what happens is over here in tier 1, we may see data that is indicating that there's a need for whatever the support is. And there's a program that exists in the building that could help at that level. And we are accidentally creating a fail first model where students have to fail for a certain amount of time before they can get access to that tier and then get access to that program. And so how can we really blend and braid our resources and the way that we're allocating our resources so that we can create these libraries of resources that when a student has indicated that there is a need, they have faster and more relevant access to that program or that support as that indication is needed. It would be very strange for one of us to walk into our local library, for example, and head down into the children's section and then have the librarian tell us, well, you don't need to go to the children's section. You don't have children, or you're not a child, or you don't have, X, Y, and Z. It was very strange for us to be blocked from that segment of the library just because on the outside, we may not look like we have a need to go there, but maybe we have dogs that like to be read to, or nieces and nephews or grandchildren that are coming over for the weekend. And so really thinking about how can we increase greater access to materials that exist without pigeonholing them and inadvertently creating a fail first model. And then the fifth critical component being that schools create dynamic partnerships with families and communities. I would argue that in terms of your ease work, this is probably where a good chunk of the work that you're doing, it probably is being focused, but that we really want to ensure that our partnerships aren't just static or one directional, but that they're really designed to support and empower each other. And so that we can really sort of exponentially create opportunity between these partnerships in the most dynamic way possible. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see probably a different version of an RTI or an MTSS triangle that you're used to. And what this is designed to do is really kind of getting you thinking about the 5 critical components and how can they be reimagined to really wrap around students in a way that really hones in on the leadership and infrastructure and continuous improvement part of MTSS and really strengthening that tier 1. And so what would happen if instead of a triangle where the tier 1 is at the bottom of the triangle and visually students quite literally leave one area to go to another, instead we've made tier 1 the perimeter of the triangle. And all of the decisions that we make are intended to strengthen that tier 1 and make it as strong as possible, but that we wrap around our students from that tier 1 angle, rather than the more laddered angle of some of the more traditional forms of RTI or MTSS that you may be used to. 4 delivery pillars. So we just did the 5. So now here's the 4 of the delivery pillars. So Maine's MTSS framework really is meant to be delivered through these 4 delivery pillars. And this would be considered on that other side of the implementation science triangle of the competencies. And the competencies being, how are these things being put into motion? So needs-based decision-making, the what, why, who, when, how, and where of meeting the needs of students as they are arising. Your educator support system, really rooting into this idea that A plus B equals C. Change for students lies in the behavior of the adults. We often think of MTSS as an intervention system. We often think of MTSS as about the students, when I would say that of 8 out of 10 conversations that I have about MTSS and intervention with schools, it comes down to what's the behavior of the adults? What are the adults doing as part of the system in order to be able to get these outcomes for kids? And so it is way more adult focused at the end of the day than it is student focused. And so that's something that we really want to start to kind of give the credit that it's due in terms of the work that needs to be done with your MTSS system. Shared leadership, that's all administrators, all educators rather, all students, all families, all hands on deck. Everybody's working together in order to put these components into place to get the ultimate outcomes for students. And then at the top of that circle, you see the common learning framework. And that's where we're looking at the common learning framework of how we're layering instruction, how we're intensifying instruction based on the and it goes across domains. So I say the word instruction, but I don't necessarily just mean academics, right? So I could mean like supporting attendance or supporting social emotional growth or supporting behavior, those kinds of things. I just say instruction because it kind of blows off of my tongue first, but to indicate that your common learning framework really encompasses as many domains as possible. And then just this little graphic over here on the left that shows that we are layering the tiers rather than moving from one tier to another, to another, to another, et cetera. So all these things being said, the one big idea that we've really come to really started to boil things down to is that MTSS isn't something a school does. It's not something that we do when things aren't going well. We really want to widen up our lens and ask ourselves, is MTSS more something that we are? And is the way that we're allocating our resources, is the way that we're looking at our data and making decisions, is the way that we are utilizing the who, what, when, and where of our school really more foundational? And how can we create a system that flexes for the students that come and go, rather than trying to create a system that's static and then expecting the students to move into individual parts of the system, whether it might be a good fit or not. So we really want to try to kind of flip that idea on its head, that the system itself becomes flexible, rather than making the students have to flex to that system. So I often do like to stop at this point just for folks to have an opportunity to self-reflect on this statement, that MTSS isn't something a school does, it's something a school is. And just sort of like marinate with some of the things that have been said so far. And if in a minute or so, if anybody wants to share out some thoughts they have on this, you would certainly be welcome to do that before we move on to the next part of our topic.
Andrea, did you want us to just come off mute and ask a question at this point, or just?
Yeah, a minute is a long time when you're like actually timing it. So whenever folks are ready, if they have some thoughts, they can kind of share out some things that maybe are coming up for them as they look at this statement. And just whenever you're ready. And if there aren't any pressing thoughts, I can go ahead and move on as well. Just
move on.
Okay.
Andrea, I could just make a quick comment.
Sure.
That we have schools at different places on this continuum of MTSS being something, isn't something a school does, but something a school is. So they're working towards the latter, because there's just so many pieces to set up the structures and systems within each individual school that certainly takes a lot of time and effort by folks, both at the district level and the school level. But so my comment really just is people are working towards that. I think that is a shared goal with this work.
It's definitely not a tomorrow goal, but it is definitely a future goal to work towards. Any other thoughts that are coming up before I move on? Oops. Okay, so thank you, Jenny, for that. So these are just a couple of more common iterations of tiered approaches to student supports that maybe folks are more common or more like are more attuned to. Where not only so like the new iteration of the MTSS triangle, that the intensity of the need and the response does go up as the needs arise. But that, tiers are, but a couple of things to keep in mind is that tiers are a level of intensity, but they're not a label, they're not a group, they're not a place, right? And so we really have to be careful that we're not referring children or identifying children for particular tiers, but we may be identifying or indicating that they have a need for some instructional intensity in some way, shape, or form. And that the intensity increases by layering the support. So I've said that a couple of times already. And that the supports themselves are not tiered, right? And so we don't want to, we really want to think about being mindful that supports are liquid or they're fluid based on the level of intensity that a particular group or particular students might be indicating a need for. So just being careful that the supports themselves, that there aren't tier 1 supports and we utilize those here, but then there are tier 2 supports and you can't get those until you get to that certain point, right? So really just keeping in mind about that more open fluidity of providing the support as the intensity rises. And this is just another iteration of thinking about this layering of support because it is one area that I think is one of the hardest to achieve. It seems like what we've been doing for the last 35 years is tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 support, but in many cases, we're not layering those things. We're really supplanting them one for the other. And so this is just another way to look at that, tier 1 is all students, tier 2 is tier 1 plus an increased intensity, and that tier 3 is tier 1 plus tier 2 plus an even further increased intensity. And you can't have the bottom without the top, or like you can't have the top without the bottom. So we don't take away what's beneath it in order to get to the one that's above it. And so thinking of it this way is that if some students need a coat, others may need a coat and hat, and some might even need a coat, hat, and mittens. Not everybody is going to need all of the supports at the same time, but adding and removing articles of clothing to base needs is the same as adding and removing supports for students to adjust to their instructional need. Right? And so just thinking about it in a way that allows flexibility, fluidity, and for students to be able to bend and flex based on their needs, and that the instruction and supports around them should also bend and flex based on those needs. So when I'm thinking about, and Jenny said it beautifully a few minutes ago, where, lots of schools are going to be in lots of different places at any given point in time. Some of them feel very, very strongly about their current RTI model, and getting them to flex away from their RTI model might be really challenging. You might even have schools within a district that are all in different places in terms of what they're applying or what they're providing for, for RTI or PBIS or any of those other types of. Some people might be bar schools. Some people might not be bar schools, but some you might have a school that's a bar school and a school that's a PBIS school and a school that says that they're nothing, within the same district. And so thinking about how what are some tools out there that folks that are, particularly folks that are utilizing the Stronger Connections grant and probably have stronger connections goals or things that they're trying to achieve as they apply those monies, is really thinking about some different types of tools that you might be able to use to kind of open up your lens to assess your MTSS and where your school or your district might be on the MTSS scale. And then how could you use that tool to help align or support some of the goals and strategies you might be trying to accomplish with your Stronger Connections grant. And so there are 3 tools that I wanted to just quickly kind of go over that could help to just help you if you're looking for support in painting a picture of your current MTSS status or MTSS level of functioning, and then how could taking a look at that pulse check on your MTSS and align that next to what your stronger connection goals might be, and then kind of use that to create an alignment plan for moving forward in terms of strengthening the outcomes of both your MTSS and your stronger connections. So the three that I wanted to go over today are actually called the Integrated MTSS Fidelity Rubric, the SWIFT Fidelity Inventory, and the tiered fidelity inventory. And if you're a PBIS school in the state of Maine, you're probably very familiar with the tiered fidelity inventory, because that is the one that they use as part of being a PBIS school in the state of Maine. And so as assessments goes, MTSS assessments go, these three are the ones that I've used the most with schools. Maine does not have its own assessment tool at this point in time, primarily for a couple of reasons. One being that I'm a team of one, and these are tools that are created over time using multiple types of people, partnerships with universities, things like that, in order to make sure that they are research-based, evidence-based, and really create a foundation for schools to be able to use so that they are, they can go in the right direction. But also that there are many of them that exist. These are just three that we are going to talk about today, but there are multiple of these, and they all have their strengths and they all have their weaknesses. The number one weakness that I didn't put in any of these is that they are vast. And so I often find that many times MTSS assessment tools are very overwhelming. Like they're very long to put into place, and they can be it can be very difficult to kind of find the forest through the trees kind of thing, like as you're going through these assessments. And so that's one thing that I will say, if you've never done one of these before, that when you're like, oh, I'm going to do this one, I'm going to download that and get going and kind of use this as a stepping off point for planning for next year in terms of stronger connections. Just keep in mind that this is not something that's done in 20 minutes or 30 minutes. Like this generally takes a couple of hours. It usually takes a team effort, those kinds of things. So keeping those things in mind. But when I was thinking about some tools to share with you that you might be able to use for some future planning, it was these three that sort of like stuck out for me as the ones that I think could align more closely, or as most closely, with the goals of stronger connections. So keeping in mind that I don't have the background knowledge that you all will have in terms of stronger connections, but I do have some very basic knowledge of the grant. So this was just sort of where I was able to go with that basic knowledge based on what I know about the tools that are available. So when thinking about the IMFR, or the Integrated MTSS Fidelity Rubric, some strengths here is that, its goal is to help promote consistent implementation. It helps to think of growth areas and strengths for continuous improvement, and it does support data-informed professional learning. So if professional learning is one of the areas where you are really looking to head with your, for your stronger connections goal, the IMFR might be a solid one to sort of look into. However, it is very time sensitive. There can be some subjectivity issues in the scoring, and that this one focuses more on MTSS implementation rather than student outcomes. So maybe might be, if implementation of MTSS is not really the goal, which my guess is it's not, as you're looking at how MTSS aligns with stronger connections, this may or may not be a tool that you might not want to put the time into pursuing. The SWIFT FIA, on the other hand, I think is much more tightly aligned with the overall goals and outcomes that are intended for the Stronger Connections grant. The SWIFT FIA really focuses on equity and inclusive practices. It is comprehensive across all domains, from leadership domains all the way to student academics and behavior domains, and really promotes a collaborative and reflective practice through the FIA model. When used simply as an MTSS tool, sometimes folks say that it's a little bit too broad for planning. Like it's like, okay, so whereas some of these models get really, really, really narrow, this one doesn't quite get narrow enough if you're looking at it in terms of implementing MTSS. However, when you're looking at it as an alignment tool in order to be able to align multiple initiatives, this tool is actually pretty strong in that area. Although it does require very high levels of systems thinking. So remember those 5 critical components for MTSS. If any one of those is relatively weak for you, then the FIA is going to feel very difficult in terms of being able to get off the ground, because it does require some pretty advanced levels of systems thinking as you're moving things forward. That being said, MTSS is a system and not an initiative. And so this is a great place for folks to start when thinking about how can I improve areas of the system which may not be functioning as effectively for me right now. And it's those areas that might be malfunctioning or not as, I mean, not malfunctioning, but not as strong as others that could be impacting the overall outcomes of your stronger connections goals as well. And because it is very broad, it's very qualitative data. It does have some limited quantitative precision that really doesn't come along with it. So it's very subjective, even more so maybe than the IMFR. And then in the third column, we have our TFI, our tiered fidelity inventory. This is very behavior focused. And so, but there are very clear structures. It is a validated tool. I know the IMFR is working its way towards becoming a research-based validated tool. I know the SWIFT is also on its way to be earning like validated status, but the TFI is already there. It is a validated and reliable tool that has been used for quite a long time. And the TFI, other strengths that it has is that it can really support ongoing progress monitoring. So if progress monitoring is an area of your stronger connections goal implementation or your grant implementation is an area of need for you, this could be a good place to look for in terms of like getting some of that progress monitoring piece in place. It is primarily behavior driven. That can be good towards your goals, or perhaps it might be too narrowing for your thinking in terms of where you want to head next. But that's something to think about. It could also be weaker in the area of equity and inclusion. I really struggled kind of putting that bullet point in here because you would think, oh, something that is validated and behavior focused and supports ongoing monitoring would probably be strong in equity and inclusion. But the SWIFT FIA really outshines the TFI in terms of equity and inclusion. And so depending on the kinds of goals that you have written for your grant, if equity and inclusion is really high up on your goals or your action planning for your grant, then maybe the FIA might be more the area to go in. But if behavior tends to be stronger or more of a focus for you, then the TFI might be a tool to use for your alignment purposes. But just also keep in mind that it does require prior PBIS language and prior PBIS knowledge and outcomes. So this is going to be very behavior focused, PBIS focused, et cetera, et cetera.
Andrea, I'm going to